Picture a kitchen late at night. The dishes are done and put away, the house has gone quiet, and the only light left is the small glow of a phone lying face up on the table. On the screen is a headline in red, "Markets tumble, savings wiped out." And there, hovering over a single word, "sell," is a thumb. Maybe you have been the person at that table. Maybe you are afraid that one night you will be. So let me pose the question this whole piece is here to answer. Across every crash and every boom, every breathless forecast that turned out wrong, what is it that actually builds wealth over the length of a life? Not a quarter, not one clever year, a life. It turns out the answer is not a secret, and it is not some perfect moment of timing that you have to catch while the rest of us miss it. It is a small handful of plain, durable rules, 8 of them, that quietly do their work in the background while you get on with living. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we will walk through each one slowly, with room to breathe. You will not get a single stock tip. You will not get a prediction about where things go next, because I do not have one, and neither does anyone shouting on your screen. What you will come away with is something steadier and more useful, a calmer way to hold money. By the end, the next red headline should feel less like an alarm and more like weather, passing over a field you have no intention of leaving. Let's begin. Rule 1. Temperament beats intelligence. If you remember nothing else, remember this one, because the other 7 rest on it. The biggest advantage you have as an investor is not how much you know, how fast you read, or whether you can decode an earnings report. It is your temperament, your ability to stay level while the people around you swing between greed and fear. Here is the quiet evidence for that. A research firm called Dalbar has spent decades comparing 2 numbers, what investment funds actually returned and what the ordinary people who owned those funds actually earned. You would think they'd be the same. They are not. Year after year, the typical investor walks away with noticeably less than the very funds sitting in their own account. And it isn't because they picked badly. It's because they bought in after a good stretch, when they felt brave and the headlines were warm, and they sold after a bad stretch, when they felt scared and the headlines were dark. That distance between what the investment earned and what the investor kept has a name. People call it the behavior gap. It is not a knowledge gap. The steadiest hand, not the sharpest mind, tends to walk away with the most. So the shift this rule asks of you is almost embarrassingly simple. Stop trying to be the smartest person in the market. Start being the calmest one. When the urge to react rises in your chest, and it will, your job is to feel it fully, and then do nothing. Rule 2. Let compounding do its slow work. Compounding is the engine underneath everything else, and it has a strange personality. It spends almost its entire life looking unimpressive, and then it does its largest work right at the very end, which is exactly why so few people stay seated long enough to see it. Picture a single lily pad on a still pond, and suppose it doubles its coverage every day. For most of the month, the pond looks nearly empty. Glance at it on the 25th day, and you would swear there was open water as far as you could see. On the 29th day, the pond is still only half covered, and then on the 30th day, it fills completely. The most dramatic stretch of growth, half the entire pond, arrived in a single day at the very end, after weeks in which it looked like almost nothing was happening. Money left alone to grow on its own growth behaves the same way. The early years feel slow, even pointless. You put money in, and the gains are so small they seem to mock the effort. That quiet middle is where most people give up, because nothing visible is rewarding them for their patience. But the abundance, when it comes late and comes fast, and it belongs to the ones who did not give up during the boring part. So measure your progress in the right unit, not this year, the decades. Those slow early years are not the price you pay for compounding. They are the engine warming up before the road opens out. Rule 3. Measure your life in decades. Patience gets mistaken for doing nothing. It isn't. Real patience is an active discipline, the deliberate choice to let time pass without interfering with it, and to weigh your results against decades instead of against this morning's headline. There's a plant called moso bamboo that makes the point better than any chart could. Once it's planted, it does almost nothing for years. A gardener watching that bare patch of soil could be forgiven for thinking the seed had simply died, but underneath, out of sight,
It is building a vast root system, one season after another, and then, in a single growing stretch, it can shoot upward many feet, faster than you'd quite believe. All those invisible years were not wasted. They were the whole point. The market has rewarded that same underground patience.
Across the last 100 years, it has lived through depressions and world wars, oil shocks and runaway inflation, a crash that defined a generation, and a pandemic that emptied the streets. And through every one of those, the long line of human effort and productivity kept climbing. None of that was visible on any given Tuesday. It only became obvious to the people who stayed long enough to turn around and look back at the distance they had quietly covered. So set your clock to the right speed. Stop asking how your money did this week. Start trusting the long arc you actually signed up for when you began. Rule 4. Never sell into fear. A falling market is uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the same thing as damage. A decline only becomes a permanent loss at the precise moment you sell into it. Until then, it is paper, a lower number on a screen, painful to look at, but fully able to recover. The drop is a feeling. Selling is what turns the feeling into a fact. Think of a saver in the winter of 2008 and into the early months of 2009, watching a balance they had spent a lifetime building fall by something close to half. Every instinct screamed at them to make it stop. And one grim morning, near what turned out to be the very bottom, they did. They sold, moved to cash, and felt that brief, sweet relief of having finally acted, of having done something.
Then they watched from the sidelines as that same market steadied, turned, and over the following years climbed back past where it had ever been. The fall had been temporary. The selling is what made it permanent. The crash did not take their wealth. The flinch did. There's a reason this is so hard, and it too has a name. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky showed, back in the late 1970s, that the pain of a loss lands on us about twice as heavily as the pleasure of an equal gain. We are built to overreact to red. Knowing that won't switch the feeling off, but it can keep you from obeying it. So when fear reaches its peak, treat the urge to sell as a signal to wait, not a signal to act. The discomfort is the toll you pay for the road. It is not a reason to turn the car around. Rule 5. Buy the whole haystack. Here is a freeing thought. You do not actually have to find the one rare winner. You don't need to outguess anyone. You can quietly own a small slice of nearly everything at very low cost and let the whole market carry you forward. There's a famous wager that makes the case. Beginning in 2008 and running a full 10 years, the investor Warren Buffett bet that a plain low-cost fund tracking a broad market index would, over a decade, outperform a carefully chosen basket of elite funds run by some of the highest-paid professionals in the business.
10 years later, the simple index had won, and not by a narrow margin. The professionals weren't fools. They were skilled people working hard. They were just paddling the whole time against a current of fees and trading costs that the simple approach never had to fight at all. The man who spent his life making that plain approach available to ordinary people, Jack Bogle, used to put it simply, don't strain to find the needle in the haystack, just buy the whole haystack. It sounds almost too modest to be wisdom, but cost and simplicity are among the very few things in all of investing that you can actually control. Nearly everything else is weather. So let go of the fantasy of picking the perfect investment. Owning the entire field, cheaply, and holding it for the long haul is not settling for less. It is winning by refusing to play a game that quietly takes from almost everyone who sits down at the table. Rule 6. Turn down the volume. Financial media has one structural problem you need to understand. It has to fill every single hour, whether or not anything worth saying has happened. Markets don't produce meaningful news every day, but the channels and the feeds run every day regardless, and so urgency gets manufactured to fill the empty space. The trouble is that almost none of it should change what a long-term investor does. Try a small exercise.
Count up, across your own life, how many times the news announced with total confidence that a crash was coming this year, or, just as often, that the good times had become permanent and would never end. Forecasters confidently call downturns that never arrive and miss the ones that do, and yet the tone of certainty never wavers from one year to the next. Underneath a lot of it sits a very human bug that psychologists call recency bias. We take whatever the weather is doing today and quietly assume it is the climate, the permanent state of things. It almost never is. Now picture two savers who own exactly the same things. One checks the balance every single morning and feels every tremor in the pit of the stomach. The other looks twice a year and barely registers the storms that left the first one sleepless. Same investments, two completely different lives. The difference wasn't in what they owned, it was in how often they looked. So treat market news as entertainment, not as instruction. Check less. You won't only feel calmer, and this is the part that matters most, you will actually behave better. And behaving better is most of the game. Rule 7. Stay in the room. This is the hard mathematical reason the panic seller loses, and it surprises almost everyone the first time they really sit with it. A very large share of the market's entire lifetime gain arrives in a tiny handful of days. And those rare, powerful days have an inconvenient habit. They cluster right next to the most frightening ones. Researchers who study long stretches of market history like to run a simple thought experiment. Take several decades of returns and then ask what your outcome would have been if you had simply been out of the market for its 10 or 20 best days. The answer is jarring. A huge portion of the total gain just vanishes. A handful of days missed, and decades of patience are badly wounded. And here is the catch that ties it back to fear. Those best days almost never show up in calm, sunny weather. They tend to arrive in the middle of the most terrifying stretches, often within a day or two of the worst drops. Which is to say, at exactly the moments when the nervous investor has just sold and stepped outside to feel safe. The person trying to time their way out of the pain almost always steps out just before the rebound and is still standing in the parking lot when it comes. So give up the dream of being in for the good days and out for the bad ones. They don't arrive on separate calendars. They come tangled together, the best ones braided right into the worst ones. Which leaves you one reliable move. Stay in the room through both. Rule 8. Know what enough feels like.
The last rule isn't about markets at all. It's about you, and it may be the one that decides whether any of the rest ever brings you peace. Wealth without a destination is just motion, and the rarest financial skill of all is knowing how to name your own enough. There's an old story, often told about the writers Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller at a lavish party thrown by a billionaire on a fashionable island. Vonnegut leans over and needles his friend a little, points out that their host had probably made more money in that single day than Heller had earned from his most famous, most beloved novel in its entire history. And Heller thinks about it for a moment and says, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. I have the knowledge that I've got enough." It's a quiet line, almost a throwaway, but it points straight at the thing. Because without some private definition of enough, more money doesn't bring rest. It just raises the bar of restlessness one more notch, and no number ever quite reaches it. The goalposts keep walking away. So do something most people never get around to doing. Decide, in plain and specific terms, what enough actually looks like for your one life. Not infinity, a number, a shape, a way of living. Give your investing a finish line to run toward, so that your peace stops depending on the next gain, and the next, and the one after that.
So here you are, back at that quiet kitchen table. The house is still asleep, the phone is still glowing, and the headline is still red. But it looks a little different now, doesn't it? Because now you know that the thumb hovering over sell is the most expensive button you will ever press. You know the slow years are only the engine warming up. You know that the storms and the best days travel together, braided too tightly to ever pull apart. And you know that somewhere out ahead of you is a number you are allowed to call enough. None of these 8 rules is clever. That is exactly why they work. They ask very little of your intelligence and a great deal of your patience. And patience, unlike brilliance, is something you can begin practicing tonight, simply by doing nothing, while everyone around you is busy doing far too much. If this gave you a steadier place to stand, you're welcome to subscribe. This is a quiet corner of the internet for people who are building wealth slowly and on purpose. And before you go, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Of these 8 rules, which one landed hardest? Leave it in the comments. Sometimes the rule that one person needed most is the very one that someone else just said out loud.